Hi guys, Ronnie here and welcome to today's video where I will give you some of my winter training tips that I have accumulated throughout the years of training. The first and biggest mistake that I see people doing is choosing the wrong clothes, and most commonly this is overdressing, in my opinion. You have to consider that when you're doing exercise outdoors, a lot of that energy that you put into the bike is, the side effect of that is generating a lot of heat. So where you don't really want a lot of layers and a lot of warming is the core and the legs, because the blood flow is going through there and it's easier to get warm and sweaty after the first couple of minutes of riding and then freezing for the rest of it, and that's exactly not what you want to do. Where you do need a lot of extra warmth is the extremities, so your head, your feet, mainly your feet, and your hands as well. It's very important to keep these warm, because otherwise even if you feel in the first hour or half an hour of your riding that you're slightly cold in the core, this will get warm eventually if you got it right. Of course, I'm not saying or telling you to ride in a short sleeve jersey when it's 0 degrees outside like today, but a light base layer and a good jacket will do. Then even if you're well dressed, it's important to regularly regulate your temperature by using your zip. I also see that many people don't do this. Whenever I hit a climb or a more intense section in my training, some intervals, etc., immediately I pull down my zip beforehand just to keep cool, because the moment you start to feel the sweat accumulating on your back, or at least that's where I feel it first, it's basically already too late. You're going to get sweaty and then cold afterwards, particularly if you're doing some climbs or some intervals. So that's the first thing. A good tool to keep track of this, and I use this quite a lot even in winter, is the core body temperature sensor. When I see my core going up above 38.2, 38.3, I start to take my zip down on the jacket to let in some extra air. Another thing that's very important to choose correctly is the intensity of your riding. Now, for most people, this is basically the off-season or the preparation period before the race season starts. So what you want to do ideally is base training and do as much of it as possible, and this is best done at a very steady intensity. Again, this is good from a physiological perspective, but also it's just more practical because you're not going to get cold or overheated, just as I was talking about before with the clothing section. It is important, however, to do occasionally some maintenance level intensity, but this will be zone 3 to 4 maximum, but your coach will prescribe that depending on your level or the events that you will be preparing for in the season. One thing regarding intensity and the rides themselves that people tend to do is to stop for cafes, etc. This is not really advisable even in the summer, in my opinion. It breaks up the flow of the endurance training. You have to warm up the muscles again, and it's really rather damaging when it's cold outside. Ideally, I would suggest not to stop at all if possible, because if you stop, your muscles will cool down. If you are a bit sweaty, you're going to get very cold very quickly, and then it's very hard to get back to operating temperature again, and that's a recipe for a bad cold or pneumonia in the worst case. So really, no cafe stops, no stops for fueling. Take it on board if you can and consume it mid-ride. Just don't stop really unless necessary. Another thing you should take into consideration is the choice of your bike and your terrain. Now, talking about bikes first, I have 3 bikes at the moment. So it's a time trial bike, a road bike, and the gravel bike, which you can see here. The time trial bike for me in cold weather falls out of question really, just because firstly I don't want to ruin it. It's prepared for racing, very minimal grease fills in the bearings, etc. pristine condition of the drivetrain. I just don't want to ruin that, and I don't really see the point of riding it in very cold weather anyway. And secondly, it's really quite uncomfortable because your upper body is extremely static on that bike, and you're going fast for a relatively low wattage, so you're just going to get extremely cold, and it's really not worth it in my opinion in terms of training gain. If I really want to spend some time in the position, then I could perhaps do it indoors on a trainer, but then again, I don't really find that very effective either, because you're not actually riding the bike, and the main thing about the time trial position is the control that you have in it, and you just won't get that on the trainer. So that is best saved for spring in my opinion. If you disagree, let me know in the comments, but this is just my experience after a couple of years of specialized time trial training. Secondly, it's a road bike. That's obviously a great tool for winter training, particularly if you equip it with some mud guards or prepare it for some tougher conditions. So that's a staple. I use that quite a lot, particularly when it's wet and you can't really go off-road. And when the conditions allow, then there's the gravel bike, which is a good mix-up. It's more fun than riding on road, and it's also a bit more enjoyable in the cold, because again, you ride quite a bit slower off-road than you would otherwise for the same effort, so it keeps you a little bit warmer. Also, when the roads are icy and snowy, usually it's still pretty safe to ride off-road, so these two make up for a good combination. Of course, a mountain bike or even a fat bike, if you live in very cold and snowy conditions, could do just fine. One more recommendation regarding choosing your bike and terrain is to not ride courses with prolonged hills or very undulating ones. Again, just for your thermal stability, it's the best ride at a steady pace on the flat, because you won't have the cycle of overheating and then overcooling on the descents. It's just more practical. And also, in cold conditions with snow, ice, etc., grip is at a premium. So ideally you want again to stay with flat non-technical roads, just straight out and back. That's just the safest and most convenient way to do it. In the winter months, people also tend to overlook the importance of ride nutrition, just because it's not a very competitive period. But keep in mind that even if you're riding for a prolonged period of time at a long intensity, you're still going to need to refill your carbohydrate sources. And the most popular way for this perhaps are gels, but I don't really find these very convenient when riding outdoors in thick winter gloves, just because it's quite hard to reach into your pocket, open it, eat it, etc. So my preferred choice is to use carbohydrate drinks with a high concentration, such as the Never Second C90. That is what I'm using at the moment, and I really like it because you can mix basically 90 grams of carbohydrates into half a liter of water. Regarding drinking, many brands and sources recommend a fixed rate of 0.75 to 1 liter per hour, but this really is utter nonsense, just because this will vary extremely with temperature. So just to give you my examples, so maybe you can go with that. When I do a 4-hour ride in winter conditions at around 0 to 5 degrees, then I'm perfectly fine with 2 half-a-liter bottles. But if we scale it up to 40 degrees in the middle of the summer, I need as much as 8 to 10 bottles for the same thing. So based on this, you need to recalibrate your carbohydrate concentration in your drinks. And just because you can't really rely on drinking that much, because you can't in the cold conditions, then I tend to supplement this with solid carbohydrate sources like bars and energy chews, which I tend to cut open the packaging for before I set off, again just to make it easier to consume when riding in thick gloves. Another thing that I've done last winter on my open gravel bike, and I will do it this year as well, is that I've installed a top tube storage bag on the bike and put all of my nutrition there. This makes it a lot easier to access mid-ride, because I find it quite hard to reach back in thick winter gloves and thick winter jackets into the back pocket and then out again, and this makes it a lot more convenient. If you use high concentration carbohydrate drinks like the C90, they also have the benefit that they're not going to freeze even in non-thermal bottles, just because they contain quite a bit of salt and a huge amount of carbohydrates, so they're much more resistant to that, so you can keep on drinking even in freezing conditions. And finally, it is important to consider the setup of your bike as well. So at the base minimum, I would suggest installing a very strong daytime running rear light. This is something I always use. I turn it off in sunny conditions because I don't find it to be as crucial, but when it's foggy or just generally dark and wet and miserable, it's important to be seen on the road just for safety. When it's really bad or it's getting dark, I also use a front light. It is also important to consider that if you want to ride actually in dark conditions, then you need a very strong front light for your bike, particularly if you will go off-road. I'm using a NOG Power Trail 2000 lumen light, which is an extremely strong one, and with this light intensity it is quite safe to ride even off-road in full darkness. So it's something I can recommend, but it's not generally really necessary if you can afford to go out during the shortened daytime light. I've already touched on the topic of mudguards. On my road bike, it is I tend to use the Crud Road Racer Mark IIIs. This is a very light and easy to install set of mudguards designed specifically for road race bikes that don't have mudguard eyelets, and these are still full-length mudguards that do a pretty good job of covering most of the dirt and water from the road, so they just make a good addition when it's wet outside. Ideally for this you would want a road bike that has a lot of clearance for the tires, as my Ostro Vam or even the gravel bike, but they fit on most road bikes anyway. And finally, one more thing I would consider are the tires. So there's a lot of debris, salt, grime, etc. when you're riding outdoors in the winter, so I think it's advisable to go for a tire with a bit more puncture protection. During last winter I've been using the S-Works Turbo Cotton Hell of the North edition with a strengthened casing in the 28mm width and latex tubes. This has proven to be a very tough combination. I didn't get a single puncture throughout the winter, even in the worst conditions, and the fact that it's a easy to install tubed clincher makes for an easy emergency fix when you puncture. This year, however, I switched to a tubeless system, so I'm running Michelin Power Cup 28mm at the moment. This is a race tire, but it has very good puncture protection, and since I'm using it tubeless with high quality sealant, and I also have foam tire inserts from Tubulite, even if I puncture I don't actually need to stop at all, even if it's a complete catastrophic failure. Because of the foam insert I can still limp back home without needing to stop. So in winter, when you really don't want to stop and fix a puncture, I think that's probably the best option, or at least it has been so far, but I'll keep you updated about how it works in the future. Okay, so these have been my winter training tips. I hope you have found them useful, and if you want to see more of this, then of course keep subscribed to the channel. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Yeah.
6 mesi.